The other person who doesn't get it, of course, is Nigel Farage. He wraps himself in our flag, but his policies don't match British values. We must call his scheme to round up and deport our French, our Indian, our Caribbean neighbours who already have indefinite leave to remain what it is.
The David Lammy debacle, Labour's self-inflicted crisis. Before we get into what might be the most spectacular political own goal Labour's managed this year, and trust me, the competition is fierce, go ahead and smash that subscribe button because the chaos unfolding in Westminster right now is absolutely relentless, and you're going to want front row seats for what comes next. Right, let's talk about David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, accusing Nigel Farage of flirting with the Hitler Youth, then watching the whole thing explode in his face so spectacularly that even Keir Starmer had to step in and essentially tell his own Foreign Secretary to pipe down. And if you think this is just another political spat, you're missing the rather extraordinary subplot about a Labour government in complete disarray. A Prime Minister who can't control his cabinet, and an opposition party that's watching all of this unfold with barely concealed glee. Now, the question everyone's asking is whether Lammy should resign. But honestly, that's not even the most interesting part of this story, because what we're witnessing is something far more consequential. We're watching Labour's entire strategy for dealing with Reform UK collapse in real time, and the implications of that are going to reshape British politics in ways that'll make your head spin. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence of events here is absolutely crucial to understanding why this matters so much. Lammy was asked whether he believed Farage is racist. Straightforward question. Should have a straightforward answer, but instead he said he'd leave it for the public to come to their own judgments about someone who once flirted with the Hitler Youth when he was younger, which is political speak for I'm going to make an incredibly serious historical allegation without actually saying it directly so I can claim plausible deniability later. Except that's not how any of this works. You can't invoke the Hitler Youth, one of the most notorious organizations in human history, and then pretend you weren't making a direct accusation. The allegations Lammy was referencing date back to 2013, claims that Farage marched through a village shouting Hitler Youth songs while he was a schoolboy in the late 70s and early 80s, and Farage dismissed those allegations as complete baloney back then and is dismissing them now. But here's the thing. Whether those allegations are true or false is almost beside the point, because what matters politically is that Labour's Foreign Secretary decided to resurrect them on national television, and that decision has created an absolute firestorm. Now, Keir Starmer's response is where this gets properly fascinating, because the Prime Minister didn't back his Foreign Secretary, didn't equivocate, didn't offer some Miller-Mauer both-side statement. He went on Sky News with Beth Rigby and said flatly that no, he doesn't believe Farage is racist, and he doesn't think Reform voters are racist either. They're concerned about borders, frustrated about the pace of change. Perfectly legitimate concerns. And just like that, Starmer threw Lammy completely under the bus, which raises a rather obvious question. If the Prime Minister doesn't think Farage is racist and doesn't think Reform voters are racist, what on earth was his Foreign Secretary doing making Hitler Youth allegations on television? Lammy's subsequent backtracking has been absolutely excruciating to watch, telling BBC News that Farage has denied it, so he accepts that denial and would like to clarify his position because the Prime Minister is keen for them to focus on policies, not individuals, which is a political equivalent of a hostage reading a prepared statement. He even trotted out the phrase, play the bull, not the man, which is rich considering he just spent an entire interview playing the man with one of the most inflammatory historical comparisons you can possibly make. But here's what makes this crisis so much worse for Labour. It's not happening in isolation. This is playing out against a backdrop of absolutely catastrophic polling for the government. Labour's numbers have been plummeting. Reform is surging. There are headlines screaming about Labour being barely bigger than the Greens in some polls. Wales is talking about a Labour wipeout. Voters who back Labour are openly saying they are switching to Reform. And right in the middle of all this electoral carnage, the Foreign Secretary decides a smart move is to accuse Reform's leader of Nazi associations. It's political malpractice on a scale that's genuinely difficult to comprehend. Farage, predictably, has gone absolutely ballistic about all this, claiming that Starmer's branding of Reform migration plans as racist will incite and encourage the radical left and directly threatens the safety of campaigners. He's calling it an absolute disgrace in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder, and whether you think that's a fair point or rank opportunism. The political reality is that Labour is now on the defensive about whether their rhetoric is putting people at risk, which is absolutely not where any government wants to be. Starmer's attempt to contain the damage had been revealing in all sorts of uncomfortable ways. Nick Ferrari pressed him on LBC about whether he'd put his political opponent at risk, and Starmer said no, that's not the case. But he couldn't exactly say much else. Could he? What's he supposed to do? Agree that his government's language is endangering the opposition? That's not politically viable. But the very fact is having to deny it tells you how badly this has spiraled. And then there's a truly delicious irony of Starmer refusing to answer whether Donald Trump's comments about London and Sharia law were racist. Trump claimed London wants to go to Sharia law, which is obvious nonsense, and Starmer said is not going to start down the road of discussing whether things said by others are racist or not, which is a perfectly reasonable position, except his foreign secretary literally just did exactly that about Nigel Farage, so either Lammy was wrong to make those comments or Starmer's being inconsistent about when it's appropriate to call out allegedly racist rhetoric. You can't have it both ways, and the fact that Labour's trying to have it both ways is why this story has legs. The calls for Lammy's resignation aren't coming from nowhere. They're coming from a growing sense that Labour's cabinet is completely out of sync with both the Prime Minister and political reality. Lammy gave a speech at Labour conference that reportedly scored 0 out of 10 from at least one attendee. There are pieces being written with titles like Keir Starmer and David Lammy prove Labour is officially detached from reality. Talk TV presenters are demanding he resign immediately. This isn't just right-wing media having a go. This is a sustained critique of Lammy's competence and judgment from across the political spectrum. The question of whether he should resign is ultimately less interesting than the question of whether Starmer can afford to sack him, because dismissing your foreign secretary less than a year into government looks like chaos, but keeping him after this debacle looks like weakness, and neither option is particularly attractive when your poll numbers are already in the toilet. What's really happening here beneath all the drama about Hitler Youth allegations and backtracking and clarifications is a fundamental strategic failure by Labour. They spent months trying to paint reform as beyond the pale, as racist, as extremist, as dangerous, and it hasn't worked. Reform support has grown. Farage's profile has strengthened. Voters aren't buying the narrative that concerns about immigration and border control are inherently racist, and now Labour's stuck because they've invested so much political capital in this strategy that backing away from it looks like surrender, but doubling down on it risks further alienating exactly the voters they need to win back. Starmer's comments about Reform voters not being racist is an attempt to thread that needle, to separate Reform's voters from Reform's leadership, to say you can be concerned about immigration without being bigoted, which is obviously true but also completely undermines the previous months of Labour rhetoric suggesting that voting reform was basically a moral failing. The timing of all this couldn't be worse for Labour because they are already dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. The polls are dire. The Labour conference was widely seen as a flop. There are questions about Starmer's leadership, about whether he'll even make it to the next election as Labour leader, about whether Labour's facing wipeout in traditional strongholds like Wales. And now on top of all that, the Foreign Secretary is embroiled in a scandal entirely of his own making that's forced the Prime Minister to publicly contradict him and defend the opposition leader. Lammy's explanation that he wasn't at school with Farage and doesn't know what songs he sang is almost painfully inadequate. If you don't know something, don't reference it on national television while making serious historical allegations. That's basic political communication. The fact that Labour's Foreign Secretary apparently needs it explained to him is genuinely concerning. The broader implications here are what should really concern Labour strategists, and you have to assume at least some of them are properly panicking about this, because what this episode demonstrates is that Labour has no coherent strategy for dealing with reform. They tried dismissing them, condemning them, warning about them, calling them racist, and none of it has worked. Reform keeps growing in the polls. Farage keeps dominating headlines. Voters keep expressing sympathy for reforms, positions on immigration and borders, and Labour's response has been to double down on rhetoric that clearly isn't landing with the electorate. Lammy's comments and the subsequent chaos perfectly encapsulate this failure. He tried to deploy the most serious possible allegation, the Hitler Youth comparison, thinking it would damage Farage, and instead it's damaged Labour, damaged Lammy personally, forced Starmer into clean-up mode, and given reform exactly the kind of establishment overreach narrative they thrive on. Farage is absolutely loving this, and why wouldn't he? He's got the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom making wild allegations about him, then backtracking, then getting publicly contradicted by his own Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Reform's polling keeps climbing and Labour's keeps falling. This is a kind of political gift you literally cannot buy. Every hour this story dominates the news cycle as another hour Reform gets to play the victim of establishment attacks while positioning themselves as a voice of ordinary people who are tired of being called racist for having concerns about immigration. The safety question Farage raised about whether Labour's rhetoric endangers campaigners is particularly clever politics because it forces Labour to defend their language while also giving Reform the moral high ground, claiming they're the ones being endangered rather than the ones doing the endangering. And regardless of whether you find that argument persuasive, you have to admire the political jiu-jitsu involved. So should David Lammy resign? The answer probably depends on whether you think government should hold their ministers accountable for spectacular failures of judgment. And make no mistake, this was a spectacular failure, invoking the Hitler Youth against a political opponent, watching it blow up, backtracking frantically, getting contradicted by your own Prime Minister. That's not a minor misstep. That's a fundamental failure to understand political communication and the boundaries of acceptable discourse. But resignation would also mean admitting defeat, would mean acknowledging that Labour's entire approach to reform has been misguided, would mean giving Farage a scalp that he paraded around for months, and Starmer probably can't afford that either. So we're likely to see Lammy limp on, diminished, embarrassed, a constant reminder of Labour's strategic confusion, which might actually be worse for Labour than if he'd just resigned immediately and allowed them to draw a line under the whole mess. What's certain is that this story isn't over. The political ramifications are still unfolding. Labour's polling continues to crater, reform continues to rise, and the question of how Labour responds to the populist right remains completely unanswered. Lammy's debacle has made that question more urgent, not less, because it's demonstrated beyond any doubt that the current approach isn't working. Calling your opponents Nazis or Nazi-adjacent doesn't win elections if voters don't believe the allegations. It just makes you look desperate and out of touch, and right now, Labour looks both. Keep watching this space, because if you think this is as bad as it gets for Labour, you haven't been paying attention to British politics lately. There's always another crisis around the corner, and this government seems particularly talented at creating their own, which is exactly why you need to stay subscribed to UK Connors, because when the next implosion happens, and it will, you'll want to be here to watch it unfold in all its chaotic glory.